after I finished that $99 gaming PC video, I went back and looked at some of those games, and using MSI Afterburner, I found that several of the games were actually CPU limited and not GPU limited. What this meant is we needed to find a way to get another processor in there that was better, or make our processor run faster. Now, to do that, the problem was our motherboard was an Intel-based motherboard, and that motherboard didn't have any built-in overclocking functions, so we were very limited in what we could do. As it turns out, I found something called a BSEL overclock. Literally, I took a piece of tape and covered up one of the pins on the CPU, reinstalled it, and it turned the clock from 2.4 GHz up to a 3 GHz clock speed, which is a significant improvement from the base clock, and as a result, I retested all of the games, and in addition to that, I've added in a few new games which I also tested in the pre-overclocked state, including Fortnite. But first, a word from our sponsor.
If you love adventuring, whether it be traveling, exploring the fascinations of the earth, or diving into an online world, come with us. Venture into the unknown and step into the void at Voodoo Realm. T-shirts, cutoffs, hats, and more. You can find it all at voodoo-realm.com. Check the link in the video description, and check out their website for a chance to win your own free merchandise. Voodoo Realm. Step into the void. Check the video link in this video's description to see more about the build process, and why the parts were chosen. First, we'll start off with several synthetic benchmarks, including Cinebench. In Cinebench, we found the single core improved by 28% and the multi-core improved by 26%. This is almost perfectly linear with the 25% overclock we did on the processor. You can see for comparison several other processors in there, including the non-overclocked Q6600, mobile 3317U, a desktop 4770K from a few years ago, and a slightly more modern Ryzen 1700. Next up, we tested Unigine's Valley benchmark. Although Valley mainly stresses the GPU, we did see a modest increase in the overall score on the overclocked CPU. A 10% increase at 720p, a 6% increase at 900p, and a 5% increase at 1080p. We then tested Unigine's other well-known GPU benchmark, Superposition, and we found no differences whatsoever at 720p, 900p, or 1080p with the overclocked CPU, suggesting this was a pretty hard GPU limit on the Superposition test. Although I'm not a big fan of UserBenchmark, I like to include it just in case people want to compare, and specifically, the single-core CPU improved by about 24%, and the multi-core CPU test improved by about 25%, which is again pretty much perfectly linear to our 25% overclock. For the Fortnite test, everything was set to lowest settings except for view distance, which was set to medium, and I tried to replicate the same location every benchmark. As with all the benchmarks, everything was taken as an average of 3 different tests, and what you're seeing are the standard deviations shown as the error bars for each graph. In my previous video, I did not test Fortnite, so not only are the bottom 3 lines new data with the non-overclocked CPU, the top 3 lines are the overclocked CPU, and by overclocking our Q6600, we're able to improve 720p by 8% on average FPS, 900p at plus 16%, and 1080p 11%, and importantly, we were actually able to get an average frames per second above 60 FPS at 720p with our overclocked CPU, which I feel is incredible for a PC that cost less than $100. For our old school WoW test, which I call the WoW Classic test, although to be fair, this is using an original vanilla client and is not necessarily, and most likely not, representative of how WoW Classic will run. On this test, we ran around Northshire, the opening human starting zone, and killed some kobolds and killed some wolves. The tests were conducted at 720, 900, and 1080p, lowest settings, in addition to 1080p at maximum settings. With our overclocked CPU, we found essentially no difference, no statistical difference between 720p, 900p, and 1080p at the lowest settings, but at 1080p on maximum settings we did see a 10% improvement on the average FPS. On our second old school WoW test, we are in Ironforge with around 100 player characters in Ironforge, and we found a 6% increase at 720p, a 4% increase at 900p, and a 2% increase at 1080p lowest settings. However, that's essentially within the noise of the error bars and isn't really statistically significant except in the case of 720p, but at 1080p and maximum settings we did see a 23% increase in the average FPS in Ironforge, which got us a little bit over 50 frames per second. In our final old school WoW test, we ran around Magmadar's Cavern and aggroed all of the mobs, as many as we could, and we found a 13% increase at 720p, a 10% increase at 900p, and a 7% increase at 1080p in the average FPS of the overclocked CPU. For 1080p at max settings, we saw a 22% increase, which allowed us to get an average FPS of almost 80, which is great for a $99 gaming PC. For our World of Warcraft Legion laps around Dalaran test, the overclocked CPU for average FPS was increased by 8% at 720p, 7% at 900p, and 13% at 1080p. With this test, we were able to achieve over 40 frames per second average at all three resolutions. However, we hit a hard cap right around 40 FPS for each of these. Using the old school Counter-Strike source built-in benchmark, our overclocked CPU was able to achieve an 8% average FPS increase at 720p, 8% at 900p, and 6% at 1080p. However, each of these tests were already well over 250 frames per second on average, so in real-world use you probably would not notice a huge improvement with this overclock. Using the Doom demo at lowest settings, we found somewhat conflicting results compared to our non-overclocked CPU, and truthfully we had a very hard time of getting a stable and fair comparison, as there is no built-in benchmark in Doom, but as a result we saw an actual 7% decrease in the average frame per second at 720p, a 10% decrease at 900p, and a 1% increase at 1080p, that 1% increase being essentially negligible. The 10 and 7% decreases, although significant, I do question whether the test was ran well. I still would like to put this up here to give you a sense of how this computer kind of can do at Doom in the opening demo. For the most part, you're expecting an average frames per second between about 20 and 30, depending on your resolution at the lowest settings, which can be playable at 720p if you're really averaging around 30 frames per second, but it's pretty rough when you get to the 900 or especially 1080p settings. Using the Dirt 3 built-in benchmark at lowest settings, we were able to achieve a 16% increase in average frames per second at 720p, a 13% increase at 900p, and a 9% increase at 1080p. This pulled up the overclocked CPU's average frames per second to essentially 120 to 130 frames per second. One of my favorite games of all time, Just Cause 2, one of the things I did here was run all three built-in benchmarks and then averaged those scores. Obviously that results in very large error bars, so that explains the large error bars. However, the non-overclocked CPU had significant problems at 900p and 1080p with very, very low scores relative to the 720p. I am not sure how much we can rely on the non-overclocked scores, but looking at the overclocked test, we're able to achieve average frames per second at 720p of over 100 frames per second, at the 900p test of around 70 frames per second, and at the 1080p overclock test of around 50 to 55 frames per second. This represents a 1% increase at 720p, a whopping 175% at 900p, and a 152% at 1080p. Again, I'm not sure the original test didn't have some problem that I'm unaware of, but the overclock test does show that you can get a pretty nice frames per second in Just Cause 2 with the overclocked CPU. Super Meat Boy makes for an excellent example of a 2D game to test on the $99 gaming PC. Now, the average frames per second were 60 frames per second even with a non-overclocked CPU. However, With the overclocked CPU, what we did see was an increase at the lowest frame times, the 0.1% lows, of 13% at 720p, 7% at 900p, and 3% at 1080p. Now, that wasn't a huge difference, but it does mean we essentially had locked 60 frames per second with the overclocked CPU, whereas with the non-overclocked CPU, we had some very minor frame dips on occasion. Our overclocked CPU saw an 18% average frames per second increase at 720p, 12% increase at 900p, and 20% at 1080p. This was a significant improvement over the non-overclocked CPU and allowed for average frames per second at all three resolutions at lowest settings of over 100 frames per second average. Using the built-in benchmark of the original Metro 2033, we saw modest improvements with the overclocked CPU, a 9% increase in average frames per second at 720p, 7% at 900p, and 6% at 1080p. This made the 720p and 900p fairly playable, but the low percentages, the 1% and 0.1% low, were still very low across all three resolutions. Running the Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood benchmark in windowed mode at lowest settings, we saw essentially no difference whatsoever between the overclocked CPU and the non-overclocked CPU. We saw a very minor 2% increase in average frames per second at 1080p, but this was not statistically significant and is essentially no change. In PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, sticking to the southeast corner of the map at medium view distance and all other settings at their lowest, we're able to achieve over 30 frames per second average at 720p using the overclocked CPU. This represented a 16% increase in the average frames per second, a 3% increase for 900p, and a 7% decrease at 1080p, although that decrease is really the difference of only a couple of frames per second and is essentially unplayable anyway, even on the overclocked CPU or the non-overclocked CPU. In my opinion, this game is really only barely playable at 720p with the overclocked CPU, because we were able to achieve just over 30 frames per second average. In Overwatch, with the lowest settings at a 75% render scale, we saw a 4% increase to average frames per second at 720p, an 8% increase at 900p, and a 1% decrease at 1080p. These are very minor changes and maybe not very significant, but either way we were able to achieve over 60 frames per second, whether overclocked or non-overclocked, which is really impressive overall for this $99 gaming PC. In a 4 vs 4 on Octagon at lowest settings in Rocket League, our overclocked CPU achieved a 1% decrease at 720p, a 0% change at 900p, and a 9% increase to the average frames per second at 1080p. The differences at 720p and 900p are essentially negligible, of course, and at 1080p, seeing almost a 10% improvement is pretty nice. That gets us close to the 80 frames per second average range instead of 70 frames per second, and overall, this PC did great at running Rocket League. Overall, I had a ton of fun buying the parts, putting this PC together, and thoroughly benchmarking and overclocking it. However, I'm putting the $99 PC to rest now, and next time we will check out a $10 gaming PC I picked up off of Craigslist, so stay tuned if you'd like to see more.